I'm just kind of hot off the plane from the Economic Social Science History Conference in Belfast. And at that conference, I was fortunate enough to be on a panel with people who were doing exactly the thing that I'm going to be trying to do, which is to talk about a little bit of something, but then talking about its significance for the bigger picture. So I was talking with David Green, a professor at King's, who was talking about the way in which revenue is converted into fixed capital. So he was giving a paper about Tomkins and the way in which essentially a hefty subscription could work its way into part of the urban fabric. That gave me a kind of an in, if you like, because I started to think about my project, about the way it converts revenue, in the sense that the old poor law was a local tax. It collected money from the prosperous, it paid it out to people who were too poor to make ends meet. But in doing so, it didn't produce capital, but I think what it did do, something which it achieved, but which we probably haven't recognised sufficiently to this point, is the way it converted revenue into economic networks. In the sense that up until now, the history of the old poor law has essentially been one which looks at the poor. It looks at the people who are receiving the welfare. And what this project does is turn the camera around so that it looks at the people who are running the poor law, the administrators, but also the people who are supplying the poor law. Those people who own businesses, retailers, wholesalers, offer services, but whose work is drawn in to the remit of the poor law by dint of the fact that they're asked to offer things to paupers. Now, I was very fortunate that the panel I was on in Belfast was chaired by Lynn Lees, who is a very eminent historian of the poor law. And she was kind enough to say, when she was introducing myself and some of the other speakers, that this was an aspect of the poor law that she hadn't considered at all, and that she thought was very important. And I suspect that might be one of the reasons we got the money. So what I want to do in this lecture is to talk a little bit about the ways in which history's economic historians have attempted to talk about the poor law in the past. And that, for the most part, involves a discussion of the impact of dispensing relief on the motivations and activities of the poor. So for the survey is really essentially, it's almost set aside from, apart from the project that I'm engaged in. But there are one or two stars here who have attempted something similar before in slightly different ways. So I want to talk about the way in which economic historians have attempted to tackle the old poor law. Then I'll say a little bit about the project, how it came about, what it's going to do, and what we hope to achieve in very broad terms. I then want to say a very little bit about parish businesses and the risks, and I think I should probably also add the word opportunities, which are involved when you start to think about the way the old poor law was run in terms of the people who are the officers, who are the overseers of the poor and the church wardens and the people who are dispensing the relief. They are sometimes, perhaps quite often, the same people who are supplying the parish for goods and services. So in contemporary terms, this was seen as a risk of jobbery. In other words, the risk that people will actively work up to their vested interest in the old poor law in order to make a profit from it. But I think it's worthwhile pausing on that for a moment, but I think we can, with this project, extend that a little bit further and say, well, there's a more subtle way to look at this, and that's about how the parish government works, how it functions, and how it functions smoothly. And then I'm going to get down to my little bit of a thing. So the project started on the 2nd of January, so we're underway. But what I want to do is to give you a case study of one of the few parishes we have actually finished, which is for the town of Uttoxeter. What finished means will, I hope, become apparent in a moment. And what surprised us about Uttoxeter was the fact that it, like many places, it had a workhouse. Like many places, it had a workhouse garden where it grew vegetables and things for the workhouse, for the pauper's diet. What we didn't expect was that they would have a make-work scheme that was a brickworks, because overseers and workhouses tended to generate make-work schemes that were rather less elaborate than that. They tended to either adopt a very low-level textile sort of operation where perhaps wool might be spun or oakum might be picked. But making bricks was a new one on me. And so what I'm hoping to do towards the end of the lecture is just to unpick some of the ways in which, it may only be an example of one, but the way that the Uttoxeter brickwork sat in its broader urban economy. So this is one of the few works, this book by George Boyer, that actually puts the word economic in the same title as the Poor Law. So George Boyer was writing 30 years ago, and he approached the Poor Law from the point of view of the ways in which welfare may or may not have influenced paupers' behaviour and morals. There's a kind of old-fashioned historiography to the old Poor Law, which says that in the late 18th century, a combination of economic factors in the 1790s meant that there were a greater proportion of the poor approaching the parish for relief were adult, able-bodied men. And the old-fashioned historiography says, well, what happened was the parish offered these men poor relief by offering them a sort of a scale of relief according to what they might need to feed their family, depending on how many children they got, how many people in their family, and that this encouraged the poor to breed. In other words, that people relied on poor relief in order to, they were profligate. They didn't think about the future and how they were going to afford things for themselves. They just relied on poor relief. George Boyer is one of a group of historians who were working to try to overturn that notion, that the poor relief strategies adopted in the 1790s were somehow inducing people to become dependent. So Boyer's history, essentially, he unpicks the economic rationale for the development of cash payments to adult able-bodied men. And he concluded that not only did giving cash to these men not induce dependency, it was a strategy best suited to the farming community. So in other words, it suited farmers for a number of reasons to ensure that there was a pool of labour available locally, not drawing on migrant poor, so not necessarily requiring people to flood into the parish at harvest time, for say, and then flood out again, but also not requiring farmers to keep people, to retain people on permanent employment contracts. They could have a kind of temporary employment contract, and the poor relief would top people up in the periods when they weren't needed for agricultural work. Boyer argued that the reason why the farmers could do this, and they saw it in their best interest to do so, was because there were a number of ratepayers who were not, their own income was not generated by agriculture, and farmers could therefore displace some of the cost of maintaining these workers in fallow periods for work onto ratepayers who had other economic pursuits. So the work, up to and including this book by George Boyer, was very much focused on the impact that poor relief had on the poor, and whether or not the poor were, as a kind of, assume they were kind of mass, which is a convenient shorthand, were not rendered dependent by the processes of poor relief. Moving forward in time, we come to Dryburgh's work. Now this, as far as I can tell, is a piece of work, the piece of work we're going to talk about is only published online, I think. But he is one of the only people, he's one of my stars. He's somebody who looks at the old poor law in terms of its influence on the people who run the law. So he made a focus of the poor law in the town of Bolton. And he said that when you look at the way that, the first thing that strikes you when you look at the overseers' accounts for Bolton is that they placed a great deal of emphasis on paying the rents of the poor. So in other words, in some parish accounts, you might find that people prioritise the use of a workhouse. In other accounts, they might prioritise the supply of food or medical supplies to the poor. In Bolton, it was rent. And he argues that the reason that the overseers placed this emphasis on rent was because it was a mechanism by which to channel money to property owners in the town. So in other words, people who owned property and who were the owners of buildings, houses, apartments or whatever, were then able to receive income from the paupers, which was underpinned or guaranteed, if you like, by the parish. So he's one of the only people who thinks about the poor law in that way. The most recent piece of work that I'm going to refer to is work by Carl Griffin, who within the last decade has said, let's look again at paupers' work, the work that people are set on as a kind of make-work scheme. He focused on the development of parish farms in the southeast of England, which were developed not uniformly by any means. His argument is they were more numerous than we might have expected, that some of them failed relatively quickly, but that some didn't. And he emphasises the seeming value of parish farms to parishes up to 1834, up to the change in the law when apparently parish farms were essentially disbarred by the legislation. And he found that they did appeal to parishes as a kind of moral force, in the sense that it enabled the parish to set the poor on work, and that it set the poor on work which avoided the kind of the stock in trade for the late 1820s. If you've got a group of adult able-bodied men, you set them to work on the roads, which was quite common, but also regarded as being attended by a number of evils. Now, when I first read this, I thought, what were those evils? What was the evil of being set to work on the road? And there seemed to be, there's a variety of thought on this subject, but contemporaries seem to think that setting the poor to work on the roads was problematic for two reasons. Firstly, it's a short-term solution, in the sense that once you've mended the road, you're then back to a serious unemployment problem. So it's not a kind of ongoing thing, potentially, unless you just continually build or repair roads. The second problem was, and this was a quote from 1828 from a parliamentary inquiry, it allegedly spoils the men completely. Now, I'm not quite sure why this would have been the case, but I assume it's to do with the fact that people don't really want to work on the roads, and so the assumption was that they would kind of loaf about. But there's nobody who says that sort of quite that starkly, but apparently it did spoil them for some reason. So the picture in terms of economic perspectives on the old poor law, what you get is quite a skewed picture if you're standing where I'm standing, in the sense that there's a fair bit of work about the impact of welfare on the decision-making of the poor. A little bit, very little bit, about the decision-making of the community in terms of overseers and ratepayers and indeed suppliers. But I have a thread of possibility from Doug Brown. So Doug's a researcher who's currently at Kingston, and he's working on the sorts of questions I'm interested in, but on the new poor law. So he looks at the law which comes in after 1834, the law which attempts to place a kind of the national poor relief system under a central authority. And he says that this central authority essentially takes quite a bit of autonomy away from the localities, because it directs groups of parishes or unions of parishes how to behave. It tells them what sorts of workhouses to build, who to employ, what the diet in the workhouse should be, what sorts of work people should be set on. So it restricts the local decision making quite significantly. But the one thing it doesn't do is restrict the choice of suppliers, because procurement under the new poor law, so long as it was done reasonably efficiently, was not something the central authority was concerned with. Doug was one of my fellow speakers in Belfast, and he was saying that in fact what you have is a small body of case law. It doesn't change very much from 1842, when there's a kind of general order goes out from the central authority giving general advice about procurement, and the end of the century. So there's there's really, if they want to find a local expression, one of the ways to do it is by following local preferences for who to employ, from whom to procure materials for the poor. And when those choices are made, they don't have to be made solely on economic grounds. So Doug says that points out that the guardians of the poor after 1834 are not obliged to choose the cheapest tender, so they don't have to pay the lowest price. And this means that social considerations, as well as material and economic ones, can come into play, so that the choice of supplier can still be a matter of, if you want to sort of, it could be a matter of interest, if we want to use that stronger word. He also made me think about the way that the new poor law concretises those within the experience of the law and those outside it. So he talks about, under the new poor law, the suppliers being in a liminal position in relation to the inside and the outside. On the inside, you have people who are thoroughly imbued in the poor law culture. They are guardians. They've been elected to manage the poor. They are paupers. They are channeled into workhouses to live. But suppliers are people who move between the poor law world and the rest, the outside. And that prompted me to think about the ways that the old poor law might be different, because I suspect the old poor law is much more porous in the sense of the movement between parish officers, suppliers, ratepayers, vestrymen, and even paupers. So my sense that there is less of an inside and an outside under the old poor law, and more of a fluid sort of complexity. But that's something that we might hope to ascertain by working on this project. So how did we get here? Well, 25 years ago when I was doing my PhD, I was working on overseers' accounts. Now these are, for me, endlessly fascinating documents. They're account books that survive for many different parishes in the country, containing the lists of people who've paid their rates, and then the lists of people to whom relief is given. And that relief might be in sums of money, it might be in food, it might be in medicine, and all sorts of little interesting, quirky details might emerge as a result of that list of disbursements, if you like, to the poor. But the thing that always got me was the phrase, as per bill. So, in account after account, I would read, we paid Mr. So-and-so as per bill, and it wouldn't say what the bill was for, and it wouldn't give any detail. Yeah, but I'm trying to work out how much you spend on things like coffins or bread. As per bill doesn't help me at all. And of course, wherever it said as per bill, there seemed to be no survival of the bill, so you couldn't do a kind of cross-checking. But I also became aware that some parishes, usually those parishes which kept every little scrap of paper that ever came their way, they might retain those bills. And they're catalogued variously in the archives as overseers' receipts or vouchers or bills or miscellaneous. And places that kept these little scraps of paper, which detail precisely what was paid, by whom, to whom, and for what benefits, where they exist, they can survive in great numbers. So, for example, the parish of Uttoxeter that I'm going to end up talking about, it's got about, I suppose, 20 bundles of these things catalogued in the Staffordshire archives. And when you open those bundles, as we have done, what you find is over 3,000 scraps of paper, all of them providing testimony to the payment of bits of money, sometimes very tiny amounts, sometimes much larger and itemised bills, for the benefit of the poor, and who received the money and for what. Now, I think the reason why historians have never really tackled these vouchers before is because they're just too complicated for any one researcher. There's a mass of material. It's quite common in my experience to open a bundle of these things, these vouchers, and little pieces of paper ping out, and they're grimy and they're scrunched up, and you have to unfold them, and you have to do a lot of work just to work out what's in there. So a couple of years ago, I was thinking, what can I do with these things? And I quickly concluded I couldn't do anything with them on my own, but that I could do something with them if I was able to marshal the forces of archival volunteers. So I approached the Staffordshire Archive Service and said, do you work with volunteers? I've got an idea that it might be an appealing project. And they said, well, yes, we do have a series of volunteer groups. What have you got? So we started with a pilot project in Staffordshire, which is a county which has perhaps 15,000 surviving vouchers across its parishes, I suppose. And so for the last 2 years, the pilot project has been working with this little group of people. This is slightly, this photograph is dated by the hairstyles of the people who are in the group. But this group of sort of 6 to 8 people who attend relatively regularly, and who, through their enormous generosity, give their time to the process of unfolding, reading. And the reading is, an interesting part of the process. The number of times that one of the volunteers says, "What does that say?" And we all crowd round and try and decipher what this piece of paper says. And then calendar the contents of those vouchers, so that we know that piece of paper is about £2 and £6 for a shoe repair. That bill is £4.10 for legal matters. And once you can do that for not just a handful of pieces of paper, but for well over 3,000 vouchers, you start to see patterns emerge that would have been hidden otherwise. Also, we're enormously indebted to not just for the time, but the expertise of the volunteers, because almost everybody who's volunteered and said yes, they'd like to be involved in this project is themselves a family or a local or a household historian. They're somebody who has perhaps been on Find My Past and Ancestry, has done their surname study. They're keen, but they want to be involved in something else, something bigger. And this is an opportunity to bring their expertise to bear, which is about, in the final analysis, drawing out and teasing out family histories and applying it to a bigger project. In other words, teasing out the family histories of people who crop up in these vouchers. There are people who might only crop up once. There might be people who have 10 or 20 or more vouchers to their name. But when you've got that core of material, when you've got a collection of those vouchers relating to an identity, to an individual or to a business, you can start to put together an image, and you can draw on other genealogical sources to try and describe their life, their career, their business in a way that you can't do for most of the time, because most of the time these business archives are, they're quite rare. So I'm not saying that by any means the vouchers enable you to sort of reconstruct somebody's business, because of course all you're doing is looking at one dimension of their business, that element of their business which gets channeled to parishes. But it enables you to take a step further to understanding the early 19th century business and its relationship with the Poor Law, which was, after all, dispensing quite a lot of money on a reliable annual basis. And I also have to say, this has become one of the favourite parts of my week. I was somebody who was nervous but keen to engage with archival volunteers, and I was enormously grateful that the Staffordshire Archive Service had a lot of experience of recruiting, working with, and supporting volunteers. But it's very rapidly become one of my favourite things to sit down in a room of people who are all thoroughly interested and engaged, and to try to unpick and work out the detail of what's going on in these vouchers. So it's something that I feel sort of doubly blessed. Not only do I get to work with the volunteers, but I've also been funded to do it. It's fantastic. So what can we hope to say, or what have we found so far in relation to parish businesses, and where can we go from that? Now, quite a lot of the vouchers contain some fairly obvious material. You expect, or one expects, having read overseers' accounts many times, to see vouchers for the supply of shoes to the poor, or the supply of medicines during illness. This is not astonishing. And therefore, we're not trying to make very much of the fact that instead of knowing that so much was spent as per bill, we now know that that was spent on a pair of shoes for this person. What's less obvious, I think, and intrigued us pretty much from the outset, was the diversity of goods and services purchased for the poor. Now, there's always been a tendency to read overseers' accounts and to pick out a little gem and say, yes, look, that shows how generous the parish were. I always think in terms of, I worked on some Shropshire and Shrewsbury parishes when I was a PhD student, and one of them bought, there was a man who was dying in the workhouse, and they bought him custards. And I always thought, oh, that's sweet. You know, he can't manage the workhouse diet. They buy him a tailored item of food in the period when he's sickening and dying. But it's an example of one. So you can't say parishes bought custards for the terminally ill. You can only say that that parish bought that thing for that person at that time. What the bills, for example, for Uttoxeter have enabled us to see is that this. The detail of what is supplied for the workhouse poor in terms of their diet is consistently more elaborate than we would have thought. For example, the workhouse, I'm talking now again about Uttoxeter, the workhouse there had a garden, a 1.5 acre garden, and the vouchers showed the variety of seeds and small plants bought for that garden. My colleague, Pete Collins, who's a postdoc on the project, has gone to the trouble of mapping out the purchases of seed and small plants for the workhouse garden onto Batty Langley's ideal vegetable garden that was published, illustrated in the mid-18th century. And he's discovered that apart from a couple of rarefied luxury items, they weren't growing asparagus in the workhouse, I'll give you that. But most of the things in Batty Langley's ideal vegetable garden are represented in the seeds and the plants that are bought for the parish workhouse, which I think is not something we'd anticipated. Potentially startling things also lie wrapped up and concealed in those vouchers. And the thing that really has leapt out at me for Uttoxeter is this make-work scheme of employing people who are poor in a parish brickyard. Before I go on to that, I just want to say a little bit about jobbery, or the contemporaries thought of it as jobbery. This is some of the very early historians of the old poor law said, well, of course, the overseers were terribly self-interested. They were always giving work to themselves or finding ways to pay their friends. And contemporaries were clearly alert to the risk of this, or at least eventually they were, because in 1815 a law was passed to say that you can't supply the parish for your own profit in the same year that you are an overseer of the poor or a churchwarden. Now, this piece of legislation appears to, as far as I can see from the historiography, just received no attention whatsoever. So no historians have noticed this or noticed prosecutions under the Act. Now, this is partly, I think, because it's very difficult to winkle out occasions of prosecution under the Act. So even when you've got digitised newspapers, for example, what do you search for? If you search for the word overseers, you're going to get a whole series of hits. If you search for even the key words in this poster, beautifully produced by a resident of Dudley who was clearly trying to keep his eye on his local parish officers, it's quite difficult to find evidence of prosecution. And indeed, it's not just historians who didn't know the Act was there. Contemporaries didn't know it was there either. So I found a case by accident almost, of a case brought in Herefordshire in 1817, where the judge was not aware of the law until it was handed to him in court. So it was clearly not, it wasn't on everybody's lips, this piece of legislation. But interestingly, there was a prosecution in Uttoxeter, beautifully, wonderfully. It just happened to be one, whereby one of the local butchers prosecuted one of the people who was the visitor to the workhouse, which is not technically an overseer or a churchwarden, and secured a successful prosecution, although he wasn't fined £100, he was only fined £5. So I think that's possibly the magistrate sort of temporising the penalty a little bit for the fact that perhaps he wasn't being that evil. So it's possible, when you've got the detail that you can draw out of the vouchers, to see some other things which perhaps skirt sharp practice, in the sense that you can see people being paid for bills either early or late, so it just doesn't coincide with the year when they were a church warden or overseer. Or you find people who just they manage to fudge it so that they are actually the church warden and they are still supplying the parish, but it's not very much. They're not making a lot of money from it. But this is where I think if we can try and see it not as a dichotomy of those who were evil and who exploited their vested interest, and those who were completely disinterested and above the issue of making profit for themselves. I think if we see it as more in terms of the parish trying to make parish government work, both for the poor and for the people who are having to run it, I think we might get a more subtle sense of the way in which people employed people they knew, employed each other, circulated the series of jobs that were required for the parish, like church warden, overseer and constable, and at the same time saw themselves as being remunerated for that in the long term by also being perhaps included in the network of parish suppliers. I think we might see, we might be able to unpick a more sensitive picture of the way which parishes had to work because they were poor and they had to be relieved. So this is where I finally get to my little bit of a thing. So this is I want to talk very briefly about the Uttoxeter brickworks. So Uttoxeter's a relatively small market town. It's right in the middle of England. It's at a period in the early 19th century where lots of communities were experiencing drastic population growth. Uttoxeter really wasn't. It didn't grow very much or very quickly. It had a reputation for cheese making, which was on the decline. And it did benefit from a canal, so there's a wharf, which enables goods to be brought in and taken away. We don't know why the parish said, I know, let's employ the poor in brickworks. We know that it was in business by 1825, when we've got the first voucher, which is the supply of wooden laths to the brickyard. We don't know. We know approximately when it stopped, because it coincided with the imposition of the new poor law in Uttoxeter, which took place a little late. It took place in 1837. We know from directories that there were no brickmakers in Uttoxeter in 1818, or there weren't any listed in the local directory, but there were some listed by 1834, including the parish yard, where it specifies that the parish yard was at the Heath, which is a piece of land which is sort of just outside the centre of the town. We know that they must have been using a proper permanent kiln, not a temporary clamp, because the vouchers that we've got show that they're not only making bricks, they're also making tiles. And in order to make tiles, which are made from finer grade clay and are a more sort of sophisticated product, you have to be able to control the firing process, which you can't do so easily with a clamp, which is a kind of temporary kiln, but you can do with a permanent kiln structure. This illustration here is the best one I could find. It's from Shropshire, but it does fit somewhat with a kind of a classic famous description of a brick kiln from 1696. And the processes didn't change very much until the mid-19th century. So brickmaking wasn't mechanised until the invention of a wire cutter machine to enable you to make bricks automatically rather than have them hand cut. So this is we're not talking about a mechanised process. We're talking about a group of men who were in the workhouse and who they don't have to go very far because the workhouse is also at the Heath. They come out of the workhouse, they put to work in forming the clay in the brickyards and then presumably loading and unloading the kilns. It's not quite clear who told them what to do. There was a brickmaker who didn't have a brickyard of his own. He was called William Harper. And so my colleague Pete Collinge's contention is that Harper was employed by the parish, and we do see money being paid to Harper from time to time, but not terribly consistently. So the the jury's out on that, I think, a little bit. Now, I've got to give credit to a former PhD student of mine. Years ago, 15 more years ago, Mike Kingman was recruited at Keele to do a PhD on brick in Staffordshire. And at the time, I knew nothing about brick at all. But he wrote a wonderful PhD, and so I can draw a little bit on his expertise to say that brick making is a seasonal process. You cut the bricks in the autumn, in November time. You cover them in straw or mats, and then you weather them over the winter. Then you temper them by moisturising them and getting out the pebbles, and then you fire them probably between about March and about September. But it might go a little bit further than that in the year. So it's seasonal work. It's not continuous work throughout the year. The busiest period is the summer. And coal is very important because coal is the chief way that kilns or clamps are fired, and coal can comprise a very significant component cost in terms of producing brick. So the cost of the coal can be half or more of the total cost of producing the brick. So I couldn't bear the thought of not knowing where this was. So we got the tithe map, and of course it was no help at all. We don't know where the brick yard was. What we do know is that in the tithe map of 1842, so when the Union Workhouse had been built, and this is the big Union Workhouse, it was built on the site of the old workhouse. We know that there were 4 brickmakers at the Heath listed in the 1834 directory, and there are 4 brickyards on the tithe map. So there's one here, right next to the workhouse. Now that could be the former parish yard, but in the year when the tithe map was drawn up, it was in the ownership of one Jane Baxter, so a lady brickmaker, who had incidentally acquired the business from her brother. There are 3 other yards, brickyards, at the Heath in 1842. So we might assume that one of the ones which is still extant was the parish one. And if it wasn't that one, it was either 587 up there. When you've got your eye in, you can see where the brickyards are likely to be. I was looking at this map and I thought, I bet 407 is a brickyard as well because of all these outbuildings, and sure enough it was. And then there's a 4th one which is just off the map below here. So we're not quite sure where it is, we've got a pretty good idea. And you can see how significant the canal was in terms of this is the canal coming into Uttoxeter and this is the wharf. So there's really not all that far to go from any of these sites to collect coal, to take it to the brickyard, and to then move the bricks out again if you're selling beyond the town itself. But the real joy of what the vouchers enable us to do is it enables us to map the resources that are going into the brickyard and then the customers taking things away. In other words, it shows us, or it begins to show us, the way in which the brickyard, the parish brickyard, which starting in 1825 at the latest, becomes completely embedded in the local economy. So the brickyard requires certain materials to run. So it needs things like sand. Sand might either be used in the fabric of the brick, or it might be used to make something called stock bricks. It was used to sort of line the wooden mould for the bricks so there wasn't adhesion, they didn't stick inside the mould. They purchased mats. Now, mats are really interesting. Well, I didn't think they were before, but now I do. I've got quite into mats. So the parish were buying things called archangel mats or Russian mats, something I'd never encountered before. They're apparently made with sedge and flag leaves. They're quite rough matting, but you could use them either in brickyards to cover the bricks over in the winter when they're tempering, or you can use them in gardens to protect seedlings and plants from the frost. So it's possible that the archangel mats were being used for both of those purposes, but there are definitely some going to the brickyard. So a whole variety of things that I wouldn't have immediately thought, oh yes, obviously brickyards need that, but there's a whole list of materials going into the brickyard. There's also a series of services which the brickyard requires in order to be able to run, either to make the bricks or then to sell them successfully without incurring a fine. So, for example, the brickyard has to pay duty on the bricks it makes, and that gives us some idea, some indications of just how many bricks are being made. So, for example, the duty that was paid in 1837 suggests that in that year the brickyard made at least 44,000 bricks. So this is quite a sizable enterprise. We're not talking about one or two. We're talking about multiple thousands of bricks. And of course it enables us to look at wharf fees for transport of coal and bricks. And it also shows us something about customers in the sense that we can see some parish suppliers having their bills offset against the bricks they've had from the parish. So in other words, if a grocer supplied the parish with rice, and the parish owed the money to the grocer for that, they might owe them less because they would partly pay in brick. Now that we didn't expect that either, that you might have a parish supplier being paid effectively in kind because you'd have their bill for bricks being offset up against the money that the parish owed them for goods. And in fact, one of the, at least one of the customers doesn't pay, the parish don't owe him any money, but he has bought bricks, and the parish have to pressure him a little bit to pay his money for the bricks he's had. But the people I really want to focus on for just 5 more minutes, if that's all right, is the labour. In the sense that this is the group of men, sorry about that, this is the group of men who are employed in the brickyard as labourers. Now, as I said, it's not a mechanised process. You pitch up, you make the bricks and the moulds, and then you go away again. And there's an 18th century estimate which suggests that this sort of 6 to 8 men at any one time can make about 10,000 bricks a day. So I don't know whether these men were good at making bricks. I don't know whether they were. I do know that some of them weren't always willing to make bricks. I'll say just about that in a moment. But the fact that I've got their names and the fact that I know they were paid for their labour, paid mere pence, just as a kind of reward money because they were actually workhouse inmates, enables me to go and look at who they were and what they did either side of this event in their lives, the fact they were employed in the brickworks. Now, some people are easy to trace. George Fieldstaff, whose name is up there. Fieldstaff it sounds like it might be quite a common name because it's got two sort of quite familiar English words joined together, field and staff. There are very few Fieldstaffs. And in fact, he's not called Fieldstaff for all of his life. He's born Fieldstead, and his family are called Fieldstad, Fieldstid. There's a variety of variations, and it's definitely him. But he ends up as Fieldstaff by the 1820s. So he's easy to find, as is Sam Neild. Neild is again a surname which is malleable. He might be Neil, spelled various different ways in different sources, but he's relatively easy to find. Thomas Cope, however, is not easy to find because there are at least 4 men called Thomas Cope in Uttoxeter. Cope's a familiar local name, and therefore it's not so easy to unpick him. But what's really interesting is the pattern that emerges when you start looking at these men's life courses, because all of them survive, or most of these men survive to the 1841 census. And what's really interesting is the fact that they go from working in the workhouse, or indeed not working for the workhouse brickyard. George Fieldstaff is taken before the justices in 1829 or 31, I can't remember which, for failing to work in the workhouse brickyard, and he gets prosecuted for it, and then he's back again by September, presumably doing the firing. But at least 3 of these men follow the same pattern, which is to say that they work in the workhouse brickyard, then they get out of the workhouse at some point in the mid-1830s, and they become lodging house keepers. So not just one of them, but at least 3 of them follow the same pattern of being workhouse labourer, lodging house keeper, and not only that, but poor rate payer. So in other words, this is a very interesting trajectory. I'm not sure that any of us would have considered that people would cross the boundary between pauper and parish supplier, effectively. First of all, of labour, but then of lodging house space. So in other words, George Fieldhouse, Sam Neild and Thomas Cope all provide lodgings for vagrant and migrant poor people. And they're all paid by the parish, which raises the interesting prospect that what Dryburgh saw in Bolton as working for the overseers becomes converted as a system for supporting the poor in Uttoxeter. In other words, you get the poor men out of the workhouse, you say, look, rent a decent-sized house and we'll put work your way. We'll give you lodgers, and that's a way that you can earn money from the parish. Now, I'm flying a kite a little bit there in the sense that I'm putting these things together and trying to see not just a pattern but a kind of narrative, and maybe working on these vouchers more and on other parishes will enable me to see my mistake. But I think this is something that I really hadn't expected, and which enables me to see the way that the brickyard works, not just as a kind of organic entity in the town, but also as a kind of a potential vehicle for men who are capable of work and who do work and who have found other forms of work as a result of having been in the workhouse. So what do I think I'm doing? The Uttoxeter brickyard may well be a one-off, but the joy of the funding is that we've been able to extend the project outwards from Staffordshire to pick other communities. So it's now not just Staffordshire, but it's also Cumbria in the north west and also East Sussex. So we get a really good geographical spread, a really interesting, diverse set of different communities and parishes, from the coastal to the landlocked and from towns to remote rural parishes. I hope that what the project will do when we can look at make-work schemes, not just in Uttoxeter but elsewhere as well, is to see the power of workhouse enterprise to become embedded in the community and also to become become a network, or generate a network of its own. It also has enabled us, quite startling, I suppose I'd always assumed that it was possible to go from ratepayer to fall on hard times, particularly in older life, and then to become a pauper. I had not anticipated that you could go from workhouse employee to ratepayer within the space of less than a decade. So that's something that I've really learnt from this project. And I'm hoping to go back to my uncomfortable bigger picture, that what this project might enable us to do is to re-envision the old poor law, to enable us to say something about not just the poor, but also the people who work for and with the poor law, partly by generating some partial biographies for people, not just the poor men who worked in Uttoxeter Brickyard, but also the grocers who supplied the mats, the men who bought the bricks and took them away, so that we can see the poor law not just as about the poor, but as about the community. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to actually take a step back and ask you about the one aspect of the new poor law, which is the old poor law, which is the fact that the practices weren't really standardized by legislation. So in your project, do you see the communities maybe adjacent to each other adopting each other's practices? Is there some sort of adaptational learning going on in the system?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think research, the short answer to your question is that not a lot in this project yet, no, because we haven't got that many parishes where we've done a lot of work that were adjacent to each other. But work on the old poor law suggests, I think, that there could be quite unexpected networks and channels of communication. So that, for example, if you had a landowner who held land in both Staffordshire and Essex, you might find that the workhouse pattern, the architecture that was used in Essex suddenly crops up again in Staffordshire because there's this personal link between these two places. So I think it's not necessarily the case that parishes next to each other are going to adopt similar practices. What you have to kind of you have to loosen up your expectation in terms of communication, because I think that there are some unexpected connections being made which are not necessarily solely based on proximity and geography.
So following up on that, you have the Stoke Trent is not very far away. You have it expanding in that period quite substantially. So you have a market
Mm-hmm.
toxic bricks.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at or do you have the vouchers from the Stoke Parish?
Again, the short answer, sorrowfully, is no. Uttoxeter is probably one of the most northerly of the Staffordshire parishes that has a decent number of surviving vouchers. There are communities, though, in the south of Staffordshire, in the Black Country, in the metalworking districts, that do have collections of vouchers. In fact, the volunteers at the moment are working on a parish called Darlaston, which is on the fringes of Birmingham, where lock making and metalworking is sort of very active. So I suppose it's possible that we might find bricks going from Uttoxeter to other parishes that have vouchers. I shall jump up and down for joy if we do. But sadly, the poor law records for Stoke, the survival rate is very poor.
You've mentioned the life stories of suppliers and something of the inmates. You haven't said much about the members of the Board of Guardians. I was just wondering, given this, say, brickworks, is that the result of the deliberation of some committee, or is it in fact some entrepreneurial individual who sees an opportunity? Can you identify particular movers and shakers in the kind of workhouse administration?
Yeah, well, as I've said, there's this man, William Harper, who gets paid, I think, probably for his expertise in brickmaking, to be the one who essentially is the foreman of the parish brickyard. I haven't said much about the biographies of people who run the parish, but that's only because of the topic I'm working on. So if you go to Google and type in Staffordshire Poor Law biographies, you will find the pilot project website. And on that there is a number of biographies, not just of parish suppliers like grocers and indeed William Harper, the brickmaker, not just the paupers like George Fieldstaff, who worked in the brickyard and then went on to be a lodging housekeeper, but also biographies of people like the assistant overseer, so in other words the salaried overseer for Uttoxeter before 1834, and others. So for example, John Chatterton was a man with a very interesting career trajectory. I'm not sure whether he was a mover or shaker in terms of the brickyard, but he started off as the workhouse pig killer. The workhouse bought a lot of pigs and grew their own bacon. And then he became the workhouse master, and he stayed the workhouse master even over the changing legislation and into the new poor law. And he was I think he was run off in about 1850 for having done something wrong. So there's some very interesting biographies too to be had of the people who are the people who run the law potentially in each year. What I don't have is vestry minutes. Now, presumably there was a vestry meeting or there was some decision taken that the land next to the workhouse could be converted to a brickyard. I don't have those decisions. When we get to once we've processed all the material and the data, we might be able to make some more informed guesses, but at the moment, no.
One of the things you might expect to find is the parish employing particularly women to keep them off poor relief or to reduce the amount of poor relief they're getting, acting as nurses or taking in old people to look after. Have you come across any of that?
A little bit, yes. So, for example, one of the entries on the Staffordshire Poor Law Biographies website is for a woman who's mentioned in one voucher. She's paid once a small sum of money, and so the blog entry is "Who were you?" and then her name, because I've tried. It's too common a name for me, unfortunately, to unpick much detail about her. But yes, there certainly were women, both who worked for the parish on their own right, and also women who signed for the receipt of money paid to their male relatives. So the fact that Jane Baxter was running the brickyard, it gave me a momentary surprise, but not really, because lots of the businesses are either run by women until their sons are old enough to take it over from them, or until they die and they transfer it. There is less voucher evidence of really poor women who are doing little bits of sort of caring jobs, like sort of sick nursing. Candidly, one of the things I really hoped I would find when we started unfolding these vouchers was things about midwives, nurses, layers out, the people doing those sorts of sort of routine but also specialised caring activities. And there aren't that many. And I think that's because they don't offer credit. So these women have to be paid immediately. So there is no occasion for a voucher. There's no reason for them to submit a piece of paper, even quite, poorly written, to say, you still owe me sixpence, because they're paid immediately. They're not like a retailer who can afford to allow the extension of credit. That's my guess.